If we look at the IT industry, there is a significant amount of work which is done by the American companies, leveraging Indian talent and what we could do from India, starting with all the way from basic services to high-end innovation, which is being done in India. So there is no question that this will have a much bigger impact on the United States.
The biggest American companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Qualcomms, 30% of their workforce is actually sitting in India right now.
Instead of having, let's say, 100 people who are doing coding, we're going to have probably 30 or 40, and the rest of them will become Agentic AI. Traditional source of revenue is going to be under attack, which means that you got to build new source of revenue, new source of growth, which could come from pivoting into the new age way of working and clearly AI-led.
Hey everyone, this is the India story, and we have with us today Rajesh Nambiar, the president of NASSCOM, which is of course the apex body which is looking at in the Indian software services, Indian service industry, the big 800-pound gorilla that has been propelling the Indian economy and the India story around the world for a considerable period of time. So Rajesh, it's great to have you with us here on the India story. Is the NASSCOM story and the software story and the services story as robust as ever?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Vikram, for having me in the show. Privileged to be here. Question you asked me is that is still robust and is it still one of the biggest stories? Absolutely, yes. I think there is so much of optimism, but when you look at the bigger picture, and you also see that there is enough of optimism and hope. But you also have a little bit of a wrinkle, if you may, that we need to sort of work out to make sure that we are staying okay with that. Yeah.
So far, of course, tariffs do not affect the Indian services sector. Are you concerned that it could?
Multiple things when it comes to very specifically, if you sort of narrow it down. I mean, there are multiple geopolitical moving parts at this point in time. But if you focus just on the tariffs by the United States, if you may. Clearly, it is on goods, so there is, seemingly there is no impact on the services. But having said that, there is certainly an indirect impact of all of this on services as well, because eventually tariffs will hit the nation, certainly the United States, which is our biggest market. Then you will find that there is an impact on the discretionary spend by these companies. So which means that there is an indirect impact with a bit of a lag, if you say. Yeah? So that's something.
That's if tariffs hurt the American economy, then the ability to spend will goes down.
Exactly. So that's the whole idea, right? So the companies will have to be careful about what is the discretionary spend, because most of our industry, if you see, there is a certain amount of spend which happens by default. But you have to keep the lights on, so most of them will happen. But many of the developmental spend that do on systems and IT systems and so on and so forth, that happens because of the fact that they have discretionary spend to make sure that they're able to improve systems, get more customer base, and so on and so forth. That will get impacted. So with a lag, that may be an impact. But the most recent ones, every day you wake up in the morning and then there is something new. There you'll find that, there may be other issues related to tariff on services. There's even some say about, maybe why don't we tariff services? You read some of that. There's also a question about having some tax which is put on some of the outsourcing. So these discussions will happen, and right now it's very speculative, but you never know.
I mean, that could be if the relationship really starts to go south, right? That's the next level of escalation, and it's almost like really now starting to fire nuclear missiles. It's not that you're not already happening. A tariff on services does affect India, hits India more than whatever's happened on goods, because that affects a few small industries. But it will presumably also hurt the American economies. There are lots of American companies that are using services from India.
Absolutely. I mean, when you really see while our services export is pretty large in any form or fashion, especially we look at the IT industry, there is a significant amount of work which is done by the American companies, leveraging the Indian talent and what we could do from India, starting with all the way from basic services to high-end innovation, which is being done in India. So there is no question that this will have a much bigger impact on the United States. Of course, we'll also be impacted, but the whole industry will get an impact.
And also, the minute you get services into the equation, the numbers also start to change. India may have a $45 billion goods surplus with the United States. But when you add services into the mix, tourism or Indian students going and studying out there, actually it then becomes a fairly balanced, the balance of trade then becomes very, very even.
Yeah. In services, it's very even. To some extent, actually, there's a little bit of a surplus from the United States side in some sense, right? So, but yeah, and it becomes larger, and there's more at stake for both the countries when the moment you look at services.
When it comes to the possibility of this happening, there's also a lot of talk about the H-1B visa, because a lot of people in America are now whipping this up. The MAGA sentiment is clear that all of these H-1B visa people are coming, and they're all coming from India. It's a scam, and they're taking away American jobs. How do you respond to that?
This has been a narrative, Vikram, probably for the last, 10 or 15 years. It used to sort of flare up on one stage and it'll go down. And we have seen the good, bad, and the ugly of the H-1B over the last couple of decades. Now, it is true that there is a significant amount of Indians who do take up H-1B as a program. It's not just for the India-based organizations or the Indian companies. A significant amount of H-1Bs are also utilized by the American companies, which are actually leveraging India talent. There's nothing wrong with it, and that's the right thing to do. So when you look at over the years, if you see from the last at least 6 or 7 years, even to some extent, even with the Trump 1.0 regime, I think companies have learned to deal with this a little better, meaning there is no longer that kind of dependency which people had on the non-immigration visas in the US, including H-1B. There are also couple of other types of visas like L-1, L-1B. These are now, companies have learned to do few things, which is one, hire local talent and make sure that you're being competitive in terms of what you're doing in the local market. Also find other means of sort of, only use these visas for pure skill mobility, which people have to go there and learn the customer system, bring it back. So if the same H-1B impact was there, maybe 10 years ago, this would have been a lot more harder for companies to deal with. Today, I think the dependency is very, very low. There will still be some amount of dependency. Some companies will still have issues. But as an industry, if you look at the average, we don't have a huge issue with H-1B or lack of it.
I've heard some people saying that on balance, it may well be good for India if the H-1B system is scrapped or curtailed, because then those same companies who need that talent are going to be employing people in Hyderabad or Bengaluru or Gurugram, and that entire money stays in India. No one is having to fly to America. So actually, go ahead. It may make India's day.
I'm not sure about that, because there is also, when you do these systems, Vikram, there is a need for, even let's say if you're doing most of the work in India, you also need to spend that time with the customer. So short-term travel, short-term visas, when people go there and learn it for a certain amount of time, while we as an industry have no issues with any amount of regulation around things like green card and citizenship and immigration related. We have to separate immigration from talent mobility. So what we are concerned as an industry is just talent mobility. The ability for people to go, whatever they need to do in whichever country, in this case, the United States, and then come back to India and then do whatever it is. So we're not, so we separate out these two, because in most of the rhetoric that you hear or the narrative that you hear from the United States, especially combining these two, there's an immigration and then the talent mobility comes together. We want to separate it out. I think, so immigration is your baby. You can do whatever you want with it.
So you're saying when the negotiations are happening, both with the United States or for that matter with the EU, as a country and as an industry, you're not bothered about whether people are immigrating or not immigrating to the United States. It doesn't affect India. Why should it affect India? We don't care. Just make sure people can come and go freely.
That's what you're saying. Come and go, not just from a travel point of view, but it's also a little bit longer than that. Ability for people to go and then make sure that they're able to stay there, do the initial amount of work. So, that model is also sort of getting a little outdated, and that's why the impact is lower. But if you go back to the older software development lifecycle model, you need to be with the customer, understanding the systems and all of that. So there is a requirement for quote unquote on-site work. So do you want me to go there and do on-site work? You do need a certain visa to stay there. And that's why the H-1Bs were very helpful.
But now you're saying a lot of that could be also done on video conferencing, Zoom.
That's one. And second, I think we're going to talk about the whole ways there are structural impact on software engineering, especially with Agentic AI and whatnot. And we'll talk about it later. But I think that has actually made the traditional software development lifecycle a lot more irrelevant. So from that point of view, also, the need for people to go there and be there on site is also reducing significantly.
Of course, and when you're going out there, you don't want your people to be handcuffed and chained and dragged off. This is happening to the South Koreans, in manufacturing. It's like it's really strange. So on the question of the tariffs and the H-1B, what would your bottom line be? Then we move to the other stuff, which is how where the industry is actually moving. What would be your ask? What would you say? This is what India's red line should be and should not be. What is it that the Indian negotiators should keep in mind and not keep in mind?
I think the fact that the volume of work which is done by the service industry and within services, the technology services plays a huge part of it. And we've been in touch with the Ministry of Commerce in terms of making sure that while we don't have a specific demand saying that we need this and we need that, I think it is important for us to make sure that we don't have an issue in terms of things like, for example, tariffs on services, etc., will certainly be very detrimental, not just for India, but also for the United States. So, yeah, our ask is very simple. I think we should probably leave us alone. And then, there isn't a big issue at this point in time because the trade balance, as you mentioned, in services is much more balanced today than maybe in goods. I would be surprised if there is anything which will be done on services.
I think this is also an area where American companies would be very worried about and be very happy to step in. If you look at the big American companies, the Googles, the Qualcomms, Apple, of course, for the manufacturing that it's doing and other things, but even the software companies, the amount of work that they're now doing in India is actually massive. So anything that happens to disrupt it does get a Google or a Microsoft really, really concerned.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is, as you know, today, when you look at our industry, it is multifold, right? There is services industry, and you talked about the BPO industry at one stage. We have the GCCs, which are actually the capability centers, which is created by the companies around the world. Then we have the ER&D companies and we have the startups. So our ecosystem is very, very broad-based. And when you look at a country like the United States, for example, they have a major share of all of that. In the sense of the US companies are creating these global centers in India. And as you rightly said, when you start to meddle with, services and how do you start to taxing it or start to put tariffs on it and so on and so forth, you're actually impacting the US companies a lot more than anybody else. Of course, there's been impact on India's industry and then our growth and our talent and our employment and so on and so forth. But it is not the only side of the story. There is a bigger story, a bigger impact probably on the US side as well.
One of the facts that is not appreciated enough, and maybe we shouldn't be telling the MAGA crowd too much about this, is the fact that actually if you look at most of these companies, something like 30%, some say maybe even 40% of their workforce is actually in India. For the biggest American companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Qualcomms, 30% of their workforce is actually sitting in India right now. So it's not a peripheral part of their business, it's a core part of their business.
And then it's more than the number, Vikram. I think the kind of work which is being done in India, be it through the GCCs or be it through the service providers, are very core. I mean, there was a time when you outsourced all this stuff that you didn't want to do and then you want somebody else to do for less. But that has changed over the years. I mean, we moved away from, sort of doing this only because of this cost advantage to the point where you're really doing this because you really need the talent for doing innovation, product engineering, people who are really able to use it. So you're now doing it more because, the way I look at it is we did began doing this for cost and then cost efficiency. That has moved over the last 10, 20 years. Right now, we are talking about enabling these centers. They enable growth, revenue growth for the companies, parent companies. It's no longer just a cost equation, but it's a revenue equation, which means that these are not something which you move this away and then you only have a higher cost that you have to pay in your home country, but you also don't have the talent, you don't have the IP that you've been creating from these centers. So it's a very, very big impact.
So when you see these headlines sometimes that, Trump's going to tell the IT companies to stop outsourcing to India, and people say, great, no more call centers going out there. It's a little bit behind the curve because you can put tariff on it, but how do you stop the fact that some of your core functions are actually being done in Hyderabad?
Yeah, no, totally agree.
It's not a call center anymore.
Not at all. I mean, it's much anything but call centers because I think India has very, very little of those what is called voice-based call center type of work. Even if they're the so-called BPM companies that we have, business process management companies, they've all shifted into data, AI, and then the work that they're doing today is much, much more sophisticated than what you saw maybe 20 years ago. But not only that, as I mentioned, remember the BPO, BPM type of companies is only a small sliver of the Indian industry. If you look at it from a IT services players, it's a very large part of it, which are actually building systems, maintaining those systems for the companies across the world, creating innovation options within technology, AI services, and so on. Then you have the GCCs, and you have the ER&D companies, and we have the startups which are actually doing a lot of work. I think the broader ecosystem is much larger, but as you rightly said, many people don't recognize them as
in fact, I'm going to start taking you through that, like the evolution, the movement up the value chain, which is often not appreciated as to how much the industry has really changed. But just to finish this point off, would it be your assessment, therefore, that if the worst comes to the worst and there is to be a tariff on services and saying, okay, we'll tax you if you are outsourcing to India? We saw that, for example, with Apple when it came to manufacturing, that they said, we're going to continue to make phones there because it's so much cheaper. Like, you tariff us, can't be helped. Is that the way you see most companies will react? They're not going to suddenly say, okay, we're going to shut down the global capability centers in India. We're going to lock them up and do something with it. They'll probably pay the tariffs right after 3 or 4 years and say, okay, now we'll see what will happen.
At this point in time, it's very speculative, so we won't be able to comment on it. But I think once we see what it is, I mean, all of that we are hearing around the tariffs around services or taxation, so on and so forth, it's all speculative at this point in time. Depending on...
I mean, it probably won't happen, just to be clear. I'm just I'm doing worst case analysis, if you like.
So at the end of the day, as you rightly know, these are not options which they've created saying that, okay, I'm going to take some of my jobs, which I don't want to do, and I'm going to outsource to India. So that model, as you rightly said, it's very, very old. I mean, so 20 years ago, this would have been a relevant conversation. They know, you outsource something, now you bring it back, or you might lose some cost advantage, but that's about it. Today, this, as you rightly say, it's a core functions of the companies are being done out of these centers in India. Be it their own centers, be it GCCs, be it service providers. Of course, I'm not saying 100% of it is high value and 100% of it is innovation, but there's a significant portion of it is done today, which is of much higher quality, which will be very, very hard for them to replicate it within the home country or with any other country. We have a very, very large share of what is really going on in the world in terms of technology services and technology innovation. And I think it'll be very hard for anybody to replace that.
How important are the negotiations, the discussions that are happening with Europe? Because a lot of people are feeling that Europe is really one of the relationships that India needs to leverage. There's already been a free trade agreement with the UK, for example, and with Switzerland and a few other countries. The EU negotiations, are you watching them very carefully? Because that could be another entire area for a sort of an untapped continent. It's not untapped, but a continent perhaps where India can do a lot more.
Absolutely. When you look at the broader industry, I'm adding everything into the mix. Roughly about 62% of what we do is with the US, so which is large. So we do need the US market. Let's not forget that. However, having said that, Europe has been huge in terms of the growth rates, and we've been able to do some work recently. I mean, they went through their own struggle, as you can remember. Then not many companies have really grown very well in Europe, but that's going to change. Same thing with the UK, and as you rightly mentioned, that we were very involved in the FTA that we've been able to conclude with the UK. I think we've gotten a lot of our ask in terms of including something called a double taxation treaty and so on and so forth, double compensation convention. All of that, I think we've been able to get into the FTA, which is good. So one of the things which NASSCOM does with our partner companies is also to sort of truly expand the market. I mean, our dependency on the US has gradually come down, but not fast enough. I think US still has the highest consumption economy in the world, which means that you'll have no choice but to sort of do business in the United States. But when you truly look at it, I think we have a global expansion in many ways. The Asia Pacific region has shown some positive trends. I mean, if you see the work that we do in Australia has increased over the years. Japan has been sort of increasing as well as a market. UAE is a great example where we formed a council in UAE to help the Indian companies to do more business in the UAE. So you will find all of these markets suddenly, getting more attention from India, because otherwise it's all one trick pony. I mean, everybody was focused only on the United States. That's going to change.
All right, well, here on the India story, we always try and build up to a sort of a agenda for accelerating change. So perhaps this could be one of the agenda items I'll just try and get out of you right now. What would be your signals that you are communicating to the Ministry of Commerce and to others, that when you're negotiating the European FTA or the American FTA, which hopefully will come back to negotiating at some point, what would be your red lines, or what would be your asks? The key things that you would want them to do, and the one or two things that you would say, please don't do this because it'll be really bad for us.
No, I think, as I mentioned before, at this point in time, from a services point of view, we would want to have, as you rightly said, the skill mobility becomes a big topic. We want to make sure that that doesn't get unduly impacted. The tariffs so far has been only within the goods arena, so that's okay. With the US, it's the BTA, which is the bilateral trade agreement. I think it's going in the right direction. We've been involved with the Commerce Ministry so far. It depends, as you rightly said. Hopefully that'll get closed at some point in time. With the EU, I mean, similar, right? I think the market, EU has been a little bit more harder in terms of skills mobility and ability for people to truly build their businesses within the EU, taxation, etc. So these will all be things that we will work with the government to ensure that we are able to get a better footing.
Let's turn our attention to the industry itself, and you've been referring to it, during the course of our conversation so far. The evolution of the industry, which is right, coding and Y2K, and that's not that long back. It was 2000, right? It's only 25 years ago. People forget. To what is happening now, where it's not the outsourcing, it's not the call centers, it's now much higher up the value chain, and now the GCCs are really driving it. If you could, in brief, just take us through that entire history of the Indian IT. I mean, it's a long history, so maybe you could just set a summary. Where we got to right now?
Yeah. No, I think it's a fascinating history. And then what amazes me, somebody who's been part of the industry and now, of course, part of NASSCOM for the last about a year or so, this industry has been extremely resilient in terms of how each of those issues, whether it is the Y2K was also turned around into an opportunity, which actually got the Indian IT industry into the world map to begin with, right? To all the way to the financial crisis in the middle, and of course, most recently the COVID and whatnot. So we'll talk about some of that. I think the real uplift in this industry came about during the Y2K regime, not because of the fact that we did a lot of Y2K work. What people often miss out is that the Y2K work would have stopped just like that on the January 1st, 2000. So imagine the companies who are doing this work. I mean, a large piece of your revenue is coming from this base, and that's all going to dry up just on that one day. Right? There is no Y2K work after 2000. So what the companies did was fascinating. What the ability, because when we're doing this Y2K work, remediation work, you got to know the customer system so intimately well. So almost without exception, maybe a few companies didn't do that, was that their value proposition to their customers was that since we know your systems so well, we're going to continue to maintain them, and we're going to continue to remediate them. We're going to continue to work with those systems because we know, because of the fact that we did 2-3 years of this remediation of the Y2K, we understand your logics, we understand how your systems operate better than anybody else. So they continue to do maintain. That gave the most Indian large service players, if you may, a lot of uplift in terms of revenue. So that was a phenomenal growth trajectory at that point in time. But when you come back to today, I think what we are dealing with, especially from a software point of view and then the systems point of view, is that fundamentally there has been structural changes in the way software is going to be built. This change has already happened, which basically means that the traditional way of software development lifecycle has changed to what we call it now, the agentic-driven software development. So today, the way the systems are imagined, if you may, or conceived or designed or analyzed, and then the way the systems are programmed, tested, implemented, maintained, all of that is going through fundamental structural shift, which means that is the both boon and the bane, or there is an opportunity at the same time. There is also threat with the amount of people.
When you're talking about artificial intelligence out here, right?
Yes, Agentic AI, which is that's what is changing. The Agentic AI has changed the way structurally how software is actually developed.
So a lot of people feel that this is an existential threat for the Indian software industry, because they say, this entire IT industry is built on people sitting and coding. AI is going to do the coding, so that's it. The Indian IT industry comes to a standstill or is rendered irrelevant. What would you say to them?
I think it's very naive to think that way because, as I mentioned before, I think this industries can become very, very resilient. And with every crank of such crises, there is actually more work which actually came to the Indian IT industry than less. You are absolutely right that there is this AI and AI, agentic AI with innovation of, especially with the generative AI and then agentic AI later on, you will find that a lot of those writing code and then doing things in a very traditional way will not be the same way in the future. That doesn't mean that you don't need people, right? You do need these services even now, actually more, but in a different area and different kind of services that what you're looking for, which means that the workforce will go through, without a question, a significant transformation in terms of saying that, if I were a programmer who was doing, let's say, C++ programming or a Python programming, I'll have to sort of look at saying that, what is my value? If this an agentic AI is able to replace what I'm going to do, I might have to do something very differently, right? So that transformation in terms of the value that you added to creating those systems, if you may, is going to change significantly. It's not going to be the same which you traditionally did. So that is what we are dealing with now.
So a lot of reskilling. I'm going to come to that also. A lot of reskilling, upskilling, different skilling, future skilling. All of that is going to be required because what you need now is very different.
That's on the skilling side. But Vikram, let's also not forget that the organizations will require to truly leverage AI, which is what everybody will do now. You need to have an AI-led transformation, which means AI is effective only as good as the kind of data that you have in the organizations or anywhere else. So to get that kind of data ready for the AI, there's so much of work to be done around, ensuring that you prepare the data for you to sort of truly leverage AI. Then you got to build those AI systems. Who's going to make all the agents? Agentic AI is something which somebody has to build. So you will find that while many of these will be, built by the agentic AI and so on and so forth, but you also have human intervention needed all along in many ways.
So certain parts of the industry will go away. Certain jobs, certain job descriptions, certain roles will start to disappear. So for somebody, watching this and saying, but I was planning a career, the areas that are more under risk would be, well, for starters, the traditional outsourced call center type stuff, right? Which is, it's going to be replaced by an AI voice, which could probably do the job better. Is that already a small section, though, of the industry, the call centers?
It is already, definitely, because there's enough automation done in call center over the years. I mean, today when you see voice-related services are very, very small. And of course, with the generative AI, which is when all of this came into a little bit more in light, I think this is going to be a different positioning at this.
But you're saying that, so the industry's already moved. It's not like 10, 20, 30% of the industry revenue now, is it? Call centers?
Yeah, they're much smaller, yeah.
Much smaller.
Yeah.
What about basic coding? The sort of coding that these days you can get generative AI to do for you, right? Writing basic, simple programs. Is that still a major component of the employment, or is it also
No, I think programming as a broad area would also have, certainly agentic AI assisted programming will become more and more. Helping people to do better programming is already in vogue today, which means that people would certainly have to use an assisted AI companion, whether it's Copilot or otherwise, to make sure that you're more productive, more accurate. All of that is becoming very, very, very popular. But the days are not too far when many of these agentic AIs could actually independently do many of this. But you still would need a lot of manual intervention in terms of ensuring that what you're doing is right, because no company is today ready, no enterprise is ready today to say that, okay, I'm going to only use agentic AI and then put them into production. So they will obviously have a combination. So we call this hybrid workforce. Instead of having, let's say, 100 people who are doing coding, we're going to have probably 30 or 40, and the rest of them will become agentic AI, which means that most of that will be generated, but you still need people to sort of look around and ensure that they're...
But the question will then become, and I understand the migration of the value chain, we'll continue to talk about it, but the first impact of that would be therefore on employment, or certainly future employment, because today it's 2 million people, give or take, who are working in the Indian IT industry?
5.9.
5.9, it's
5.9 million, yeah.
So 5.9 is a lot, right?
Yes.
5.9 million people are working in the area. When you're looking out 4 or 5 years, if a lot of the work is now being done by AI or agentic AI, then that number perhaps is either going down or at least remaining flat.
The future growth of the industry will begin to decouple the revenue growth from the people growth, for sure. To what extent is something which will be very dependent on the individual organization and what they're trying to do. The kind of work that you did will eventually dry up, which means that you want your workforce shifting slowly into the newer areas where you need very different kind of skill set, deeper capabilities, and people who can actually make it work for your client. So that, if you not that 100% of your existing employee base is going to shift to the new base, then will be a workforce rationalization. There's no option. So that is what we'll go through in the near future. But let's not forget that when you look at about 3 years outline, not 2 to 2.5 to 3 years out there is no question that technology-enabled services will go up, which means the need for technology, the need for people to build technology will only go up. Now, you could argue saying that most of them will get built by an agentic AI or AI. It's possible, right? But you still will have highly qualified technology folks required at that point in time. But we'll go through the transition over the next couple of years.
So one of the possible areas that I think, a lot of people are going to be looking at is what exactly is happening with the GCCs, the Global Capability Centers. We referred to it briefly earlier in the conversation, but the fact that you're having company after company around the world saying that a lot of key work of ours is going to be done in India, it means to that extent, that much of the value is now being built in India. It's not just the factories, but a lot of very key work is being done in India. And as technology becomes more and more important, that's where it's happening. Talk to us a little bit about the GCCs. What is happening here? What is the sort of work that is being done? And to what extent could that become one of the most important bedrocks of the Indian economy?
Absolutely.
And the India story for that matter.
Yeah, people don't realize that. And I mentioned the way the IT industry is evolving, and then we are in middle single digit. There are a lot of green shoots within that. And one of the green shoots, I would say, is that certainly the GCCs. And, we call it GCCs and a lot of attention at this point in time. But let's not forget that the initial, the GCC equivalent, those days we never called them GCC. We called them by other names. We used to call them captive centers. We call them global innovation centers, etc. Finally, we settled on this name called GCC, good or bad. That's what we're living with at this point in time. But initial ones came in 25 years ago, right? Or probably even a little earlier. And these were the American Express of the world, which actually did a lot of work in places like Gurgaon, a lot of retailers like Target, and others who actually did that. If you look at today where they have come, one is, in terms of numbers, roughly about 1,750 at this point in time in India. So 1,750 of these GCC have been set up in India. They employ collectively roughly about 2 million people, 1.9 million to be very precise. And then the revenue which is generated out of this ecosystem today is roughly about $65 billion, which is very significant. And of course, there are other numbers being floated around. From a NASSCOM point of view, we call somebody a GCC only if you're serving yourself in some sense. In the sense, we don't call the service providers as a GCCs, which means all the technology companies who, for example, your example of Google and Apple, we don't consider them as GCC, right? We're only considering GCC when people have set up shop in India to serve themselves, not other clients in some sense. So it's a very small difference, because that's why you'll find some of the revenue numbers a little different. But more importantly, when you look at GCCs a while ago, which is what set up about, let's say I was talking about 20 years ago to 10 years ago, to where they are today, I think it went from a broad transformation of focusing on cost arbitrage to having, labor arbitrage and so on and so forth. Today, I think the evolution that we have seen in these GCCs are phenomenal. Many of them have made India as a technology hub, innovation hub. So today, I think there are more GCCs who are actually leveraging India for its innovation talent, innovation capability, high-end talent, as opposed to the ones which they came for at the beginning. So they came for the cost are advantage, but they stayed for the innovation and the ability for them to do
They
much.
came for cost and then stayed on because of the quality.
The quality, and then also the ability for them to influence the revenue for the parent companies.
No, I was surprised to hear that NVIDIA has about 10-15% of its
There you go.
workforce in India. You hadn't thought of that. Qualcomm, I think, has some 40% of its workforce,
Right.
sitting in India, which is actually quite surprising. The advantage that India has, you said the number and the amount of trained talent. Now, some of that does exist in let's say, China also. But China is more closed. It's not that easy to go and set up a GCC. There is that language issue, the cultural connect between Silicon Valley and India. Are those still, I mean, the language skill is not as important as it may be in, let's say, in a call center, but the cultural, the language, the openness, is that India's key calling card in that?
Absolutely. I think we are by far, as I mentioned, the largest talent pool for technology.
English speaking and English comfortable talent pool?
Absolutely, right? It sort of grew over a period of time. So it is all of that, as you mentioned, in terms of culturally more compatible, this language, and then the right price point in many ways, ability to scale, decent level of infrastructure. Infrastructure is not our strength.
But it's improving.
It's improving. Ease of doing business, we are okay, but we are with lot to be done, and I'm sure we constantly work with the government to make sure that we make it easy, because there are, when you're at GCC, you have issues like transfer pricing and taxation, etc. So we kind of help them to make sure that it makes it easier for people to come in, set up shops here, and then make sure that they're able to take advantage. At least I don't see China anywhere close to in this segment of it. I mean, they could get to anywhere, right? But in this segment, I think it's been a bit of an issue for them. Even when you look at the second biggest country which is doing GCC, it won't be China. It'll be other countries which are actually probably it'll be by far the largest in terms of how we do the GCC.
The reason I was asking about that was that there are a number of countries that are going to start seeing a very sharp drop in workforce. South Korea comes to mind, Japan comes to mind, these countries. So for them, the ability to actually set up GCCs in India and get a lot of work done out here, and because there may be always an issue of getting too much workforce there because of cultural other reasons. Immigration is going to become a hot button item all around the world. So the ability to tell all these countries where you don't have to get mass immigration, set up a GCC in India and you can run a lot of your work there, presumably is something that you're thinking very aggressively about.
Yes, I mean, there are certain countries which are more amenable to do this very seamlessly than others. I mean, and there are part of Asia Pacific who've done a phenomenal amount of work in India, Japan included. But you also find that we are only scratching the surface at this point in time, Vikram, in the GCC story. As I mentioned, we are 1750 or so, I mentioned. By 2030, we have an estimate that it will go up to about 2,300, which means that we are setting up roughly about 90 or so GCCs every year, which means a couple of GCCs a week is what we're setting up. So the growth story has been very, very good over the last 2 years. Hopefully, it'll continue to be the same, because you never know with all the noise around. I think we hope that that flow doesn't get impacted. But remember, if you look at a Fortune 5,000, I mean Fortune 500, almost everybody is present in India, right? Almost everybody. But the moment you go into Fortune 2,000, Fortune 5,000, then you find that the mid-market, mid-tier companies, I wouldn't call it mid-tier because they're still about $1 billion or so in revenue. But for them to set up something in India, they are going through that cycle of, to some extent, there's also FOMO associated with some of this. So all your peers are sort of doing something in India, leveraging India, so you get better cost proposition. So what do you want to really do? And they're helping you innovate faster. So there's also revenue proposition. So how do you really going to take advantage of it? This is going to drive a lot of mid-market companies to set up GCCs in India. Now, we also always say that it's not just setting up of GCC. You also want to have a hybrid model of some GCC and some service provider. So you start out with this. There are many consulting organizations. We don't get into any commercials, but I think we do have multiple consulting organizations within India which will help these companies to set up these GCCs within India. So you're going to find a lot of activities.
Continuing to track the journey up the value chain, let's then turn to what many people feel is one of the more exciting things that is happening now in India is, ER&D, which is, you're actually working on core products, core IP is being created.
Right.
And a lot of people would be surprised, I know that I was, to see that ER&D is actually almost where BPM was. You think of India as BPM or earlier called BPO is going to be giant. This is much higher end work And in terms of revenue, it's either caught up or about to catch up.
No, I think ER&D has been a significant success story. And I talked about this green shoots and we talked about GCCs. Remember, ER&D is not just, they are part of GCC in some sense, because when we count GCC, we also count some of the ER&D.
A lot of the work happening in GCCs is ER&D.
Yeah, but the ER&D, also there are service providers who are large corporations within India who are doing service providers who are only focused on the ER&D as a segment. So it's a combination of some of that. But to very specifically focus around engineering services, if you see, they've done very, very good job, and their growth has been phenomenal, because I think the talent required for product engineering and how they've been able to build some of this was not obvious at one point in time, right? I think most companies, there are some dedicated organizations, lots of them were done phenomenally well. There are also the large technology services provider also had an engineering division within them. So these are people who are working directly with the customers in terms of creating the core products, and the ability for them to sort of curate that and then help them with building some of that has been a huge success. And over the last, I would say, 3-4 years, they've grown almost double the size of what the technology counterparts have been able to do.
So that's going to bring me to the question that I'm sure you knew I was going to ask you at some point, which is, all of this is fantastic. What about the final leap up the value chain? Because at the end of the day, it's the apex predator, if you like, who gets a lot of the value, which is the people who own the product, right, who own the IP, who actually are creating the products and are branding it and are putting it out there. They get a disproportionate share of the value. India's not got there at all. As a product nation, we are still not there. As an IP nation, we're still not there. So all the other work is being done by India and by Indians, but not that final piece. How do you get there?
It is a tough one because of the fact that when you look at India, 0.7% of our GDP is spent on R&D overall. Most nations would spend roughly about 2% of their GDP on R&D, doing core research, meaningful intellectual property, and so on and so forth. But we've been improving, right? All the recent announcements that you saw from the government. So there are two parties to this, right? Actually, three parties. You have government who needs to spend a lot of money on R&D. You do need the industry to open up its wallet to create more R&D. I mean, our industries, especially in our segment, we haven't done a lot of work in R&D within our company. There are some companies who spend a lot of money on doing research and development, but you don't find that as a rule in every company. Third is around our university systems. All three needs to do a lot more than what we are doing today to get us into this sort of the upper echelon of ensuring that you're creating more intellectual property, creating products, as you mentioned. But we have come a long way from where we were. You can see that the line is trending towards creating more and more. And we talked about product-led delivery. With the pivoting into the generative AI and then agentic AI, etc., you will also find that it'll get a little bit more easier for us to sort of move into the product capability. So, for example, in NASSCOM, we do have a deep tech club, which we encourage, not just from the startup point of view, but even other medium to large organizations to invest and create more products, if you may. So, over a period of time, you will find that the product-led delivery model will dominate. And we also have an IP initiative, which is encouraging companies to create those IP, register it here, register it in the United States, and make sure that they're able to take advantage of that.
I mean, there's some IP and some innovation, some technology in India, which is clearly world-class. I mean, UPI comes to mind, for example. And a lot of people are wondering why we can't productize that and really roll it out around the world. There's nothing in the world which can even remotely compete with how good that is. Maybe that's the way to start getting the brand India going in some of this.
No, it's a core of everything that we do in research. So it's a DPI, for example, digital public infrastructure, which has been, certainly a government initiative, helped many of the entrepreneurs. Today, I think DPI is going global. I mean, there are many countries which are actually taking, when I said DPI, it is a multiple stacks. That you have the identity layer with Aadhaar, and then you have on top of that you have the UPI layer, which is for the payment, and then there are other components of it, right? There are many other components which have been built around what we call digital, public infrastructure. This is very popular, in terms of having conversation with other countries. Countries like Brazil, for example, is very keen on how they leverage this. There are many other countries. Sri Lanka is another one which we've had some dialogue. So we do have multiple organizations within India now focused on, usually non-profit organizations who are actually focused on curating this DPI, taking it to the other markets, and then making sure that we are able to do it. But at this point in time, it's not commercialized. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Nambiar, let me wind my way towards now getting an agenda of action. The whole point of this podcast is to try and find things that can be done to accelerate change and to make an agenda for action. So if you had to sketch out 5-point agenda by which this industry could move even faster than it is right now, what would that agenda be?
I haven't thought through a 5-point, but let's see if we can start and see. Maybe we'll get to 5. I think you should begin with, we work very closely with the government. Let's start from skilling and talent, which is it's going to be, it's the biggest advantage for India. We want to continue to double down on it. But the fact that with all of the generative AI and agentic AI, the skilling what we knew is actually changing to what the skills required for the future. The talent, it's a little bit broader topic. NASSCOM has started a talent council. I think we'll continue to push the agenda. But it's a very big topic for what we call a tripartite, which is government, industry, and universities or academia. So these three we need to get together as a tripartite to truly make the difference into moving into the new age capabilities. So that would be a top agenda for us.
Okay. Number one, skilling, making sure that the talent is there specifically for the AI world that is now approaching.
Absolutely.
That's number one.
Second, we need to recognize that for the industry, if you look at our IT industry and you ask me what is it we could do, we need to recognize that there are going to be significant amount of headwinds in the traditional source of growth and revenue. And the recognition that most people, I think almost all of them have recognized that, but I think there is still a notion of, is it really coming or, can we continue with the same trajectory? So it is important for us to recognize that there's a traditional source of revenue is going to be under attack, which means that you've got to build new source of revenue, new source of growth, which could come from the fact that I mentioned pivoting into the new age way of working and, clearly AI-led. And I'm sorry that I'm saying AI-led in everything because that is the reality.
That's the reality.
There is not a single thing in the technology world we can talk without truly making sure that you're able to take advantage of AI. So that would be the second in terms of,
be prepared to pivot.
Be prepared to pivot. The third, if you may, will be around geographic expansion. Why am I saying that? When I look at both the macro and the geopolitical tensions and uncertainty that we have in the marketplace, there is no question that we have to make sure that we are able to make that broad-based, if you may, and expand into areas where you may not have a geopolitical tension, if you may. So that means that, getting into, areas like EU, the UK,
Korea.
Japan, Korea, Australia. So all of this, broad-basing your market is going to be a big agenda for us. We will help. We have created more councils this year than any other year, which means that we have apart from the US CEO Forum, we have a UK council now. We have created a UAE council, as I mentioned before, based in Dubai. Then we do have we do want to sort of look at councils across the board.
New locations.
New locations, yeah.
All right, that's a large number of agenda items. Let's hope that they start making a move on some of those. But let me just end with the rapid fire round, which I always do.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you 5 or 6 very quick questions, one word answers. AI, job creator or job destroyer?
Job creator for some, job destroyer for others.
Could be a bit of both. Okay.
Yeah, a bit of both.
Which skill will save the most tech jobs in the next 5 years? AI, cloud, or cybersecurity?
Learnability.
One global tech CEO whom you would really wish would come and collaborate more with India's tech ecosystem?
I would not want to name one individual, but I don't think that the global CEOs can ignore India. So they will.
They're all looking at it already.
They're looking into collaborating with it.
If you could fix one thing in Indian higher education tomorrow, what would it be?
Truly understanding that it has to be things that need to teach in the universities will have to be what the industry really wants. They need to make that pivot into very industry.
Make sure that what you're teaching people is what actually leads to jobs and not
there's a huge gap.
Theoretical concept.
Exactly. There's a huge gap, has always been. Unfortunately, it's not their fault. It's not industry's fault. It's not government fault. They need to just come together and make that happen.
Bangalore, Hyderabad or Pune, which do you think is going to be the future tech capital?
Look, Bangalore will continue to be the broader, hopefully they'll solve all their infrastructure issues and eventually they'll get to where it is. I've seen Hyderabad growing rapidly in the last couple of years. I think they've grown more than any of the other two. Pune has a little bit of a edge as well in terms of what they're trying to do. So it's difficult for me to call that. But
okay. Biggest myth about Indian IT layoffs today? The biggest myth?
The myth is that every layoff is AI induced, and that's not true at all. I think what is true is that the inability for some of the workforce to pivot into what is going to be new, and that is what is causing some of the layoffs. I think if they're able to pivot well, if they're able to learn, and remember you asked me about skill set and said learnability. If they're able to learn the newer technology, they're able to be agile and then pivot into the new world, I think there won't be any layoffs.
All right, finally, a startup sector that you think is somewhat underrated right now.
Biotech. I think that's a sector I think it's going to catch up quite a bit, and I think not many people have paid attention to the amount of impact that they could have on our lives.
Rajesh Nambiar, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you
us
so
on the
much,
India
Vikram.
Story.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.